How does a doctor become a war criminal? How does someone trained to heal people end up convicted of genocide? This is Radovan Karadžić, psychiatrist, poet, political leader, and architect of mass atrocities. Over 8,000 people killed at Srebrenica in a single week. A city under siege for nearly 4 years, with residents shot while getting water or bread. Thousands detained in camps, tortured, expelled from their homes. To understand what happened, we need to go back to the beginning, before the war, before the violence, to see how a man with a white coat and medical degree used his training not to help people, but to harm them at a massive scale. This isn't just a story about one war criminal. It's about how professional expertise can be weaponized when ethics disappear. Radovan Karadžić grew up in a remote mountain village in Yugoslavia, a country that officially preached brotherhood and unity but never quite buried its ethnic divisions. The schools taught solidarity across ethnic groups, but families at home remembered old conflicts and grievances. He was ambitious. He chose to study medicine at the University of Sarajevo, then specialized in psychiatry. This wasn't just about healing. Psychiatry gave him tools to understand how people think, what drives their fears, and how group psychology works. He learned to ask the right questions, to read people, to understand the mechanics of anxiety and control. He presented himself as an authority on the human mind. People respected that expertise. But even early in his career, warning signs appeared. Allegations of financial misconduct surfaced. Money disputes with colleagues, questionable billing practices, favors traded for personal gain. He seemed to view professional rules as obstacles to work around, not ethical boundaries to respect. This pattern mattered because it showed his core approach. The goal justified the means. Karadžić's psychiatric training gave him specific knowledge about trauma and how it affects people. He learned that unpredictability wears people down faster than constant pain. Random punishment is more psychologically destructive than predictable punishment because people can't adapt or prepare. He understood learned helplessness, the concept that when people experience repeated negative events they can't control, they eventually stop trying to change their situation. He also learned the opposite principle, how controlled fear can bind groups together around a leader who promises stability and protection. Fear without a clear solution creates chaos. Fear with a designated protector creates loyalty. This knowledge became powerful and dangerous when Yugoslavia began to fracture in the late 1980s. Economic crisis, political decentralization, and rising nationalism created widespread anxiety. Different identities competed for attention and resources. In this environment, someone who could translate anxiety into meaning, who could name threats and offer solutions, became valuable. He also wrote poetry, which mattered more than it might seem. Poetry gave him cultural credibility. It implied depth and sensitivity while leaving his actual positions vague. Verse carried emotional weight without requiring hard commitments. It let him appear thoughtful and cultured while building a political base. As the country struggled with economic crisis and rising nationalism in the late 1980s, Karadžić started testing his rhetorical skills in public forums. He attended cultural salons and gave public readings, using nostalgia and historical grievances as his main themes. His delivery was distinctive, a soft, measured cadence paired with sharp, divisive claims. He framed ethnic tensions as a psychological emergency that required immediate action. His language focused on our safety, our children, our history, our survival. He offered a clear enemy, other ethnic groups, particularly Bosniaks and Croats, and a simple solution. Serbs needed to organize and protect themselves first. It sounded like concern for his community. It was really about building a political movement based on fear and control. He borrowed the staging and language of his clinical work. Just as a therapist names a patient's fears and offers a treatment plan, he named collective fears and offered political treatment. The parallel was deliberate. It made his message feel professional, measured, and legitimate. Karadžić was exceptionally skilled at code switching, showing different faces to different audiences. To medical colleagues, he remained the dedicated clinician who understood complex cases. To cultural elites in Sarajevo, he was the thoughtful poet who appreciated art and history. To local Serbian officials in smaller towns, he was the pragmatic fixer who knew how to navigate bureaucratic systems and get things done. Each group saw a different facet of his personality. Together, they created a composite picture of a Renaissance man, intelligent, capable, multifaceted, and confident. This diversity of personas protected him from scrutiny. If someone questioned his political activities, he could point to his medical work or cultural contributions as evidence of his good character. When multi-party politics opened up in Yugoslavia in 1990, he was fully prepared. He helped found the Serbian Democratic Party in Bosnia. And critically, he didn't abandon his doctor title. He weaponized it. The word doctor carries specific authority. It suggests gatekeeping, the power to diagnose who is sick and who is healthy, who needs intervention and who doesn't, who is a threat to public health and who isn't. In a medical context, this power is constrained by ethics and oversight. In a political context, those constraints disappeared. The fundamental medical principle do no harm became do no harm to US. The grammar stayed the same, but the meaning shifted completely. It was no longer about protecting all patients, it was about protecting the in-group, even if that meant harming others. Karadžić pioneered the use of medical and technical language in political contexts. He used terms like stability, meaning ethnic homogeneity, hygiene, meaning ethnic purity, normalization, meaning forced displacement, screening, meaning identifying targets, relocation, meaning expulsion, temporary measures, meaning permanent policies. These words felt safe, neutral, and professional. They sounded like the language of public health or urban planning, but in practice they narrowed who counted as human and who could be targeted for violence. He borrowed the structure of clinical practice and applied it to politics. Assessment, which means identify the threat. Plan, which means develop a strategy. Intervention, which means implement the solution. Review, which means assess results and adjust. It sounded methodical and scientific because it followed a legitimate professional model, but now the patient was an imagined ethnic collective, and the intervention meant targeting neighbors and former friends. He was also careful to maintain what's called plausible deniability. He used conditional language. If there's a crisis, then measures may be necessary. He avoided explicit threats while building a vocabulary that justified extreme actions. He would say temporary measures knowing they would become permanent, but the word temporary gave him cover. When no one rolled back these temporary measures, they became the new normal. As political tensions rose in the early 1990s, Karadžić's strategy shifted. He stopped trying to calm people's anxiety. Instead, he deliberately amplified it and tuned it like an instrument. He learned exactly how far he could push his audience without breaking their self-image as decent, defensive people. He kept his message framed as defensive. We're just protecting ourselves from those who want to harm us, while systematically building offensive capabilities, militias, weapons stockpiles, parallel government structures. He invoked past injuries, real and exaggerated historical grievances, to forecast future threats. This rhetorical move invited people to act preemptively. Preemption felt like prudent self-defense. It made escalation seem not just reasonable, but morally necessary. If you truly believe the other side is planning to destroy you, striking first becomes survival. The pattern was consistent across his speeches and writings. Name the fear, define the enemy, offer containment. And critically, the tone always stayed calm. That calm delivery suggested competence, control, and rational thinking. It helped people accept extreme positions because they were delivered in such a measured way. When political space opened up in 1990, Karadžić didn't just enter politics, he systematically built a parallel power structure. He helped found the Serbian Democratic Party, or SDS, in Bosnia, which framed itself as protection for Serbs, not aggression against others. The language sounded clinical and defensive: stabilize the situation, secure our communities, preserve our heritage. He defined the situation as existential, a matter of life and death for the Serbian people. If survival was at stake, any action could be justified as necessary self-defense. He used history selectively, not as objective memory, but as a weapon. What happened before will happen again unless we act first. This was zero-sum thinking. If they gain political power, we lose it. If we wait, we'll be destroyed. Therefore, we must act now. His political rallies functioned like twisted group therapy sessions. He asked questions designed to lead people toward conclusions they already feared. He mirrored their anxiety back to them, validated it, amplified it, then offered his plan as the solution. He used emotionally loaded terms that sounded specific but were actually quite vague. Encirclement, betrayal, demographic pressure, existential threat. Then he prescribed corrective procedures, using administrative language, draw clear boundaries, form local councils, control communication channels, coordinate security forces. The calm voice and controlled emotional delivery made extreme positions sound reasonable and necessary. Behind the political speeches, new institutions grew rapidly under the banner of safety and self-defense. Local councils in Serbian-majority areas aligned their policies with central SDS leadership. Media outlets coordinated their messaging to reinforce the same narratives. Security committees formed links with armed groups, then gradually rebranded these groups as protection units or territorial defense to make them sound legitimate. The word doctor continued to function like a stamp of approval on policy documents. It suggested there was measured professional thinking behind decisions. Vague language provided additional cover. Verbs like would, might, could, if required. This ambiguity shielded real intentions while allowing flexibility. International observers often misread what was happening. The speeches sounded defensive. The preparations looked like reasonable precautions. The careful language maintained deniability. Professional norms like don't accuse without definitive proof became exploitable gaps that provided political cover. When war broke out in 1992, Karadžić's forces moved quickly to surround Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina. They controlled the high ground, the hills and mountains surrounding the city. From these positions, they could see everything below: the streets, the markets, the schools, the hospitals. This siege would last 1,425 days, nearly 4 years, from April 1992 to February 1996. It became the longest siege of a capital city in modern warfare. The military strategy was deliberate and psychologically sophisticated. Artillery shells didn't come in steady streams. They came in clusters that could last hours, then long periods of silence, then a single shell to reset everyone's fear just when people thought it might be safe. Sniper fire stitched across major boulevards that residents grimly renamed Sniper Alley. Every ordinary errand became a life-threatening risk calculation. Do I cross now? Do I wait for a lull in the shooting? Is that lull real, or is it bait to draw people into the open? The choice of targets revealed the strategy. A shell deliberately fired into a bread line said that nowhere was safe, not even when getting food. Attacks on hospitals and ambulances said that even medical care and humanitarian work were vulnerable. Trams that once carried workers to their jobs became slow-moving targets for gunners who paced their shots. The goal was visible in the pattern: make ordinary life feel like an unbearable gamble. When getting water or bread could kill you, when children can't safely go to school, when hospitals aren't safe, normal life collapses. And that collapse was the strategic objective. From a psychiatric perspective, the siege demonstrated textbook application of psychological warfare principles. This was learned helplessness deployed at scale. When punishment arrives seemingly at random and outcomes feel unpredictable, people lose their sense of agency. They can't plan effectively. They can't protect themselves through preparation because there's no pattern to follow. People started planning by days, then by hours, then by minutes, and eventually, many stopped planning at all. They moved from corner to corner, moment to moment. Social connections that normally buffer psychological stress began to thin under the pressure of scarcity and danger. That social fragmentation weakened the city's capacity to organize collective action beyond basic survival. Command responsibility in this context worked through a pattern of priorities and permissions rather than explicit written orders. Military units didn't necessarily need formal memos, telling them to target civilians if every other signal pointed in that direction. If commanders who hesitated faced reprimand, while commanders who showed aggression faced no consequences or even received promotions, the intent traveled clearly without requiring signatures. Sarajevo residents developed their own survival algorithms, passed person to person. You counted to 4 before stepping off a curb. You learned to identify the sound of different weapons and incoming mortars to estimate where they would land and how much time you had. You memorized which stairwells had sandbags in place and which courtyards tended to draw fire. The city's map became a mental overlay of sightlines, danger zones, and relative safety. One surgeon in a central hospital learned to triage patients by touch when generators failed and lights went out. He tracked blood types in a notebook, gauged anesthesia needs by listening to breathing, and timed surgical procedures to gaps in shelling. He navigated dark corridors by keeping one palm on the wall, counting door frames to find his way to an operating room held together by tape, scavenged supplies, and battery-powered lamps. A family facing the crossing of Sniper Alley to bring insulin to an elderly aunt spent 2 days watching patterns and timing. The father tied a white cloth to a stick, not because he believed it would protect them, but as a plea for mercy. The mother studied a balcony across the street where glass had flashed at noon, suggesting a sniper position. They moved in broken sprints using burned-out buses and destroyed kiosks as cover. A shot cracked the asphalt ahead of them. They froze, slid behind a wrecked car, and waited for a tram to pass, using its movement to mask their next dash. Meanwhile, spokespeople for the besieging forces maintained a consistent narrative. They denied responsibility for civilian deaths, blamed provocations, or even claimed that the city's defenders were shelling their own people to gain international sympathy. These statements weren't necessarily meant to fully persuade international observers. They were designed to create just enough confusion and doubt to delay serious international intervention. The siege also created profound scarcity that redefined every aspect of daily life. A bucket of clean water became currency. A working lighter was significant leverage. Batteries were precious. People adapted in remarkable ways. Basements became makeshift bakeries, schools held classes in cellars. Musicians played concerts to drown out the sound of shelling for 20 minutes at a time, offering psychological relief. International responses came slowly and incrementally. UN observers had limited access to the city. Ceasefires were negotiated and announced, then violated within days or sometimes hours. UN resolutions promised consequences but lacked enforcement mechanisms. Humanitarian corridors gave television cameras access and provided some aid, but they also gave armed forces a predictable schedule for when to pause and when to resume. Each delay, each failed ceasefire taught the attackers a crucial lesson. They could continue with limited consequences. It also taught civilians not to trust promises of protection or peace. Investigators would later prove the systematic targeting of civilians through artillery logs, impact analysis, and forensic evidence. They mapped angles of fire, trajectories, and documented repeated impacts on civilian gathering areas like markets, water points, and funeral processions. But during the siege itself, proof competed with noise. The gap between real-time harm and real-time recognition or action grew wider as months stretched into years. To understand how political rhetoric became mass displacement and violence, we need to name the project clearly. Ethnic cleansing meant the systematic removal of entire populations through coordinated fear, detention, sexual violence, forced transfer, and selective killing. It wasn't chaos, it was an organized system where each component pushed toward the same result, make staying feel impossible and leaving feel inevitable. Detention camps formed the core of this system. Existing buildings were repurposed: factories, schools, warehouses, sports facilities. These locations were chosen because they were already designed to hold large numbers of people and control their movement. Places like Omarska, Karaterm, and Chernopolya became sites of systematic abuse. The process began with forced separations. Men were split from their families at checkpoints or during house-to-house searches. Women and children were sorted into groups based on ethnicity. The stated reason was security screening, but the real purpose was control and intimidation. Interrogations inside these camps used deliberate techniques: sleep deprivation, exhaustion through forced labor, systematic humiliation, and threats against family members. The goal wasn't actually to extract information. In most cases, there was no valuable intelligence to gain. The goal was submission. The goal was to break people psychologically so they would accept whatever came next without resistance. Language prepared the psychological ground for violence. Neighbors who had lived side by side for generations were systematically relabeled. They became elements, extremists, infiltrators, or simply the others. This linguistic shift was crucial. When you strip away human labels and replace them with category labels, you lower the psychological threshold for violence. Humiliation followed as deliberate ritual: forced head shaving, forced undressing, replacing names with numbers, forcing people to perform degrading acts. These weren't random cruelties. They served a specific function. They taught guards and perpetrators to see victims as objects in a process rather than as people experiencing violation. The techniques simplified conscience and made participation psychologically easier. Documentation quietly but unmistakably connected political leadership to ground-level practice. Karadžić's orders and directives established the legal framework for detention camps where thousands endured brutal conditions, torture, starvation, and systematic violence. His signed documents authorized what were euphemistically called separation procedures, which in practice meant systematic humiliation and abuse, designed to break cultural identity. His directives referenced clearing operations, screening processes, and temporary relocation, bureaucratic euphemisms for forced expulsion and imprisonment. These policies weren't accidental or unauthorized. They deliberately targeted cultural identity and human dignity, creating trauma specifically designed to silence future testimony and prevent communities from ever rebuilding. The administrative machinery was meticulous. Registries listed ethnicity, home addresses, and property ownership. Curfews and residency checks created predictable patterns and windows of vulnerability. When buses arrived at dawn to relocate people, their routes and schedules matched internal memos authorizing mass transfers. Paperwork made violence appear orderly and legitimate inside the system, while keeping it blurry and deniable from outside. When international observers asked questions, officials pointed to forms, procedures, and regulations. The documentation created a veneer of bureaucratic normalcy over systematic atrocity. From an ethical and psychological standpoint, familiar patterns of moral disengagement appeared throughout this system. Euphemism softened language, transfer instead of deportation, protective custody instead of imprisonment, processing instead of detention and abuse. Displacement of responsibility spread guilt so thin it seemed to disappear. I just followed orders from above. I wasn't in charge. Local commanders acted independently. I only did my small part. Advantageous comparison created moral comfort. At least we're not as bad as others. We showed more restraint than they did. We chose the lesser harm. Each mental maneuver helped individual participants maintain some self-image of decency while advancing systematically indecent outcomes. This is how systems of mass violence recruit and retain ordinary people as participants. Sexual violence operated as policy, not as random war crime. It was systematic, widespread, and served strategic purposes. It attacked individual bodies and also community bonds. It broadcast dominance. It seeded shame that would silence survivors and prevent testimony. Someone with clinical understanding of trauma, how it fragments narrative memory, how it isolates survivors through shame, how it delays disclosure, could have used that knowledge to design support systems and protection. Instead, in this context, those well-documented psychological fracture lines were relied upon as features, not bugs. The trauma response itself became part of the weapon, suppressing evidence and deterring any thought of return. The international response developed slowly, in fragments. Early reports came from brave journalists and NGO workers who managed to access affected areas. These reports met immediate denial from Serbian authorities, then gradual, partial verification as evidence accumulated. But the process took time, crucial time. Access to suspected detention sites was negotiated, delayed, and carefully staged. When inspectors finally arrived at some facilities, they saw cleaned-up rooms while the worst abuses had been moved to other locations or temporarily suspended. Each week of delay buried more evidence, scattered more witnesses, and normalized a new floor for what the international community would apparently tolerate before taking serious action. Inside the apparatus itself, compartmentalization made complicity feel ordinary and manageable. A clerk stamped an approval on a list of names. A driver checked vehicle tires and fuel. A guard unlocked a door at the designated time. None of these individuals fired a weapon that particular day, but all of them kept the conveyor belt of violence moving. The system worked like an assembly line. No single person felt responsible for the final product. For families facing these systems, unpredictability crushed the ability to plan or protect loved ones. A summons could mean a routine job screening, or intake into a camp, or complete disappearance. Choices had to be made under extreme duress. Sign papers, securing your apartment, board a bus to reunite with family, leave property behind for safekeeping. Each individual decision looked rational in its immediate context. People made the choice that seemed least dangerous in an impossible situation. But in aggregate, these coerced choices dismantled entire communities. And that was precisely the design, coercion disguised as voluntary choice, so that later it could be claimed that people chose to leave. Srebrenica, the massacre. Srebrenica started as a promise. It was declared a UN safe area after months of violence elsewhere. Displaced families gathered because the label suggested protection. It wasn't. The UN mandate was weak. Peacekeepers arrived with tight rules, little ammunition, and a belief that presence alone would deter attack. The besieging forces watched, tested the limits, and timed their move. When the offensive began in July 1995, outposts fell quickly. Perimeters shrank. Civilians surged toward the main compound, pressing against fences. Inside, soldiers tried to hold a line that existed mostly on paper. Karadžić's orders for Srebrenica resulted in the systematic execution of more than 8,000 Bosniak men and boys, the worst mass murder in Europe since World War II. His specific instructions included execution protocols and body disposal methods designed to destroy evidence and traumatize survivors into silence. The separation process started under the cover of screening. Men and boys were pulled aside, told they'd be checked for military roles, then reunited with families. Women, children, and elderly were directed to buses. The language sounded administrative. The reality was different. The men moved one direction, the buses went another. They would never reunite. A column of thousands tried to escape through the forest, hoping to reach safe territory. They moved at night, whispered at dawn, argued over routes. Ambushes met them. Surrenders followed under false promises of safety. Some made it out, many didn't. What followed was organized killing. Trucks and buses followed preset routes. Holding sites were prepared in warehouses. Schools and fields, guards organized arrivals into groups, bound them, moved them again. This was logistics, not chaos. Execution sites were selected for terrain and concealment. Bulldozers waited with full tanks. The process cycled: unload, bind, shoot, bury. The goal was speed and volume. Concealment became a second operation. Crews returned to original graves, exhumed remains with machinery, and moved them to new locations. Bodies were torn and scattered. Fragmentation wasn't accidental. It was designed to break forensic evidence and accountability. Leadership statements stayed consistent. Denial, deflection, claims of lawful military action. They suggested men of fighting age fled. Casualties were combat-related. Numbers were exaggerated. These statements weren't meant to fully convince. They created enough doubt to delay consequences. Investigators assembled the truth piece by piece. Satellite images showed disturbed soil in geometric patterns, then later showed new disturbances at different coordinates. Forensic teams mapped graves, documented bindings and blindfolds, traced bullet pathways in bone. DNA work restored names to fragments. Transport logs aligned with missing persons lists. Fuel and equipment records matched excavation days. The pattern held. Witnesses filled gaps. Drivers described queues of buses and waiting machinery. Guards recalled euphemistic orders: secure, process, and what they meant in practice. Survivors from the forest described ambush points and false promises. Their stories converged. In court, Srebrenica was named genocide. The legal phrase, in whole or in part, mattered because it captured the method. The targeted elimination of men and boys aimed to destroy the group's future and make return meaningless. Destroy the next generation and you wound the community beyond repair. That was the intent. The ethical inversion was profound. A leader trained in fear, trauma, and group dynamics presided while those dynamics were weaponized. He could explain how intermittent terror breaks people. He could predict how shame silences testimony. Instead of preventing harm, that knowledge justified it. International reaction lagged behind the killing. Debates on mandates and air support dragged on. By the time new authorization arrived, the primary killing had shifted to concealment. Institutions responded to yesterday's atrocity, while the next phase had already begun. After the war, Karadžić went into hiding, but he didn't hide in remote bunkers. He hid in plain sight. He grew a thick beard, let his hair grow long, and changed his speaking style. He adopted a new identity as Dr. Dragan Dabić, a wellness practitioner offering alternative medicine. He used gentle, vague, reassuring language, energy alignment, psychophysical integration, holistic balance. It sounded therapeutic while meaning nothing specific. He offered stress relief and health advice in small clinics and community centers. The thing is, he repurposed his old psychiatric skills. He mirrored people's worries, reframed their symptoms, promised relief. The sessions felt like therapy without documentation. The safest hiding place was normalcy. Cash at the door, flyers with phone numbers, short segments on local cable TV where he talked about stress and wellness. He avoided official identification but maintained regular patterns. The same cafe, the same clinic, the same Monday TV slot. A small network supported him without knowing the full picture. Investigators didn't find him through one dramatic clue. They found him through patterns. The same bus route, the same clinic appearances. His face under the beard matched old photographs if you looked carefully. Surveillance focused on routine. Low-key cameras watched entrances. Phone records near his locations revealed recurring contacts. The city's network of connections did the rest. One afternoon in July 2008, officers waited near a clinic. No sirens. A van idled nearby. Plainclothes officers approached as he stepped outside, verified his identity, and arrested him quietly. No chase, no drama. 13 years on the run ended in 2 quiet grips and a van door closing. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia charged Karadžić with genocide, crimes against humanity, and war crimes. The trial centered on command responsibility, the idea that leaders are responsible for crimes committed under their command. Evidence came in layers. Administrative orders used euphemisms like screen, transfer, process. Meeting minutes aligned with troop movements and municipal takeovers. Logistics records, fuel, buses, bulldozers matched timelines of killings and burials. Satellite images showed soil disturbed in rectangular patterns, then disturbed again months later. Forensics catalogued blindfolds, bindings, bullet trajectories. DNA analysis identified victims. The record grew through accumulation. No single document condemned him. The weight lived in the pattern. Survivors described separations, checkpoints. The moment routine turned deadly. Insiders, clerks, drivers, officials translated euphemism into reality. A guard recalled orders to process faster and what that meant. A radio operator explained coded phrases. Each testimony was narrow. Together, they revealed a system. Karadžić's defense tried multiple angles. First, they challenged the tribunal's legitimacy. When that failed, he distanced himself from the violence. He argued he set policy, not tactics. He claimed actions were necessary responses to threats. If outcomes were unlawful, he said, they were unauthorized excess by field commanders. He pointed to public appeals for restraint and framed meetings as attempts to control chaos. But restraint leaves evidence. It looks like commanders removed, operations stopped, investigations launched. The record contained little of that. Where violence served political objectives and logistics preceded provocations, distance claims fell apart. The key legal question, could a leader be held responsible when he claimed to want protection, not harm? Judges looked at sequence and scale. Did violence consistently serve his stated aims? Did preparations come before the justifications? When preparations preceded provocations, inference sharpened. These were plans, not reactions. The tribunal weighed coherence across sources. Forensics, intercepts, and documents set boundaries. The legal standard was beyond reasonable doubt. The evidence met it. On genocide, Srebrenica was central. The court examined intent to destroy a protected group, in whole or in part. The targeted killing of men and boys, combined with the machinery to execute and conceal it, demonstrated intent to destroy the community's future. In part mattered because it captured the method. Destroy the next generation, prevent return, empty the territory. The reasoning relied on pattern, preparation, and concealment. The systematic nature of expulsions, detentions, and attacks formed this charge. The bureaucratic precision argued against claims of mere wartime chaos. Registries, transport coordination, property. Seizures, these showed organization. Appeals challenged legal interpretations and factual findings. The appellate chamber adjusted some details but preserved core findings. The written judgment did more than sentence. It created a permanent record. Throughout the trial, Karadžić rationalized with clinical language. He talked about necessity, proportionality, and appropriate responses. He wrapped harsh actions in therapeutic metaphors: quarantine, stabilization, public health measures. The inversion remained stark. Knowledge that should have strengthened ethical boundaries instead polished justifications. Expertise without ethics became manipulation. The sentence, 40 years, later increased to life imprisonment on appeal. A doctor's training was used to organize mass harm. Medical language and psychological expertise provided cover for atrocity at scale. The lesson is simple but critical. Expertise without ethics becomes a weapon. Authority without accountability enables abuse. Professional credentials don't guarantee moral behavior. They can actually make manipulation more effective. Before trusting any authority figure, ask, what checks exist on their power? Who holds them accountable? What happens when they're wrong? These questions matter, because the tools that can heal can also harm. Intent makes all the difference.